Well, thank you all very much for inviting me to this gathering. I've not met this kind of a meeting before, so I don't know how to proceed except to give the usual lecture, which may or may not be the appropriate way to approach it, especially as the subject is very elusive as far as I'm concerned. I gather you have all been talking about laws, and I actually have a particular interest in history, and I believe there's a relationship between history and laws which might be of interest, and I may take you a little further into history than you are accustomed to, but that's the only way I know how to look at the kind of law that I think about and talk about most of the time. Both these words, law and history, are very big words and full of varieties of meanings, layers of meanings, innumerable adjectives before each of them to try and sort out what you mean, what kind of law you're talking about, what kind of history you're talking about. And by the fact that we need so many adjectives to describe what we're talking about really suggests that we'll always have difficulties with these words. But nevertheless, I want to go back to what I believe is the original sense of both the words history and law, to see the connection, to try and pin down a particular set of connections which I believe still relevant, still very much in play in our lives today. And I refer to the very simple, basic relationship between governance and history. And governance, of course, is never far away from law, at least the law of the state's relationship with, or the ruler's relationship with his subjects, the state with the citizens. And there are again many dimensions to that, but I won't go into the details of this, but simply the concept of laws being made essentially by states and are certainly the basis on which most states perform their roles. And rulers are always been aware and conscious of the need for laws to ensure that his or her rule is methodical, systematic, easy to control, and able to actually determine the fates of the different states. So that relationship is a very ancient one and probably needs less explanation than other kinds of meanings of the law. And history has the same kind of relationship in some ways, because all rulers at some point or other are very concerned to tell their story. What did they do? What good did they do? Why people should remember them? Why it is important that their version of what they did would be preserved, respected, admired forever and forever. So the ruler's interest in history, or his story, or her story, is probably as important as a ruler's need for good laws, or laws that enable the ruler to rule properly. So I start with that rather simple approach to it and try to keep it to that level, because the other dimensions take me too far and I can't cope with them. I then pick on China as an example of where the relationship between the ruler and his history, and the ruler and the law, seem to be rather different from elsewhere, and why it is still meaningful and relevant today. I start with China partly because China has one particular distinction from many other civilizations, is that they don't seem to have much of a concept of a god. So that there was no way in the Chinese tradition to connect law, or history for that matter, with God, with a higher being. There's always been a kind of, I wouldn't use the word secular because that's a very misleading word, but a kind of earthly, down-to-earth idea of what laws can do and what history should be taught, or what kind of history should be written. And for the Chinese, starting with their very earthly understanding of life, really starts with the idea that all these, whether law or history, are man-made. They have nothing to do with God, nothing to do with some universal natural principle that is superior to man, but something that man made, man can remake, and man can dispense with. So that, I think, is the way the Chinese normally think about both these concepts. And in their original ideas, in fact, if I may just go back a little bit to look at how it all began. Again, as I said, without any godly intervention, man thought of what are the best ways to rule over their people. So the idea of the ideal ruler, what are the ingredients of good governance, was there from very beginning, from the earliest documents that have survived in Chinese history. The emphasis has always been on the performance of the ruler, how caring, how successfully he has got rid of his enemies and made his people love him, respect and admire him, and therefore has laid down the fundamentals of what good governance means. And underlying that, of course, would be certain concepts of what we might call law, because they determine how things should be done, what is acceptable, what is not, and who gets rewarded and who gets punished. All that becomes part of that governance part. But at the same time, as I said, all rulers are concerned how his rule or his principles of rule, the success of his rule is transmitted to future generations. And therefore, how that story is told is also very important. And the way the Chinese, as far as we can tell from the earliest records of how they did it, was to make sure that certain key documents that represent what they thought would be preserved and be read as a guide to good governance. And those documents are the kind of policies that were made, the kind of statements and declarations that were made by the ruler to set down the parameters of his or her rule. And the survival of those documents would ensure that that story that wants to be told is told and kept in people's memories forever. And that is the function of history, is to enable the people of future generations to appreciate what was achieved and what were the secrets of success, or for that matter, the lessons to be learned from failures to be learned for future generations. And then transmission of that knowledge through the documents becomes vital. So who keeps the documents? Who keeps it? Who records it? Who enables those documents to be preserved becomes a major responsibility of the officials or those responsible have to do. And we might call them historians, but I don't think they're historians. They are the recorders, and they ensure that the story is transmitted. Of course, as we know, in ancient times, documents are not well kept, and most of the documents were lost and disappeared and have been reconstructed, reshaped, and I believe this is true throughout the world. The ancient documents, none have survived in the original form. They've always been transmitted form, and the transmitted form after many centuries may or may not be right, may not be genuine, may not be authentic for the original story, but have been reshaped, retold, rewritten to convey what needs to be transmitted. As each generation determines what was good about the past that needs to be transmitted, they adjust the record accordingly. And who does that, then again, is a professional job, as it were, people who do the transmission, to make sure that more or less the right message is transmitted. And if it isn't quite right for the times, they can modify it a bit, change it so that it's acceptable and therefore represents a new interpretation of the original intentions of the ruler who had set the records in the first place. Now this can be done, of course, to many generations. By the time we actually get the document that survived, it may be quite different from what was the original, but that's not important. What is important is that document has survived, and it represents the present, or at that time, the present interpretation on what as the correct story that should be transmitted for future reference. But that is a job. And similarly with laws, I suppose, because in the Chinese tradition, there is no such emphasis upon the law. The law is actually transmitted through these documents, and these documents are transmitted by professionals who ensure that the documents tell the correct story, or the correct version of what needs to be transmitted. So this goes on for a long time. Until about 2,000 odd years ago, about the time of what they call the period of the spring and autumn annals, roughly contemporary with people like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, slightly earlier. As someone has called it, the axial age seemed to be across the world. And somewhere about that time, the Chinese also got round to evaluating what had survived, and trying to make it look more systematic, and that it represents something that was integral and organically support and rationally explainable to future generations. And the man who was known to have done it for one part of it was Confucius, of course. And the Chinese attribute a lot to him, but of course he did claim to have put together, as he said it, he didn't make any new rules. He simply drew upon all the previous records and did the job of transmitting what he thought was the correct way of understanding the past to be of value to the rulers of his own time. And there's a big difference, which is important, very important in the Chinese context. And that is that all the ideal documents that has been transmitted represented the governance of a particular dynasty, particular ruler and his successors. But by the time of Confucius, that sense of unity of civilization or an entity or even kind of polity had come to an end. It had become a time of warring states. In the time of the spring and autumn annals, there were probably as many as 200 little states, all vying for some kind of dominance over its neighbors. And that period was extremely difficult, and there were lots of fighting, merging, formations of new alliances, and so on. I won't go into that at all. Just to say, Confucius saw his role as trying to pull together everything in the past, the traditions and the institutions that he thought would help the rulers of his time to bring about a more peaceful regime for the civilized part of the world that he knew. And in order to do that, he picked on the records that he thought really were authentic transmissions of what was ideal in the past and why they should be followed if the kind of governance that he saw necessary for the country could be restored. And he described the need for what he calls the Liu Jing, the 6 classics that he would say essential for the transmission of true knowledge to enable the Chinese civilization to flourish. As you all know, Confucius was spectacularly unsuccessful in his lifetime. And he taught a number of students, but none of the rulers listened to him, and nobody took his advice. So he cannot be blamed for the wars that went on for another 200 years. During the warring states, when as they fought, and this I suppose happens elsewhere as well, as they fought, there were fewer and fewer states as smaller states got eaten up by the bigger ones. And by the end of the spring and autumn annals period, about something like the 4th century, they were down to 7 states. And by the 3rd century, it was down to 1. And the one was the one that reunified, or they call it reunified, because theoretically there had been a one state before of the Zhou dynasty, and something like 800 years later, they brought it back together again as one state. And this was, we all call it now the Qin Empire, the unified empire of the Qin dynasty. And it was done, and this is the crucial point, it was done without any advice from the Confucians and their transmitters of the ideal story of how governance should be transmitted, but it was done by a bunch of people who had practical experience, including administrators of each of those states, including those who saw the need to do certain practical things to enable any particular state to win over the others, with all sorts of strategies, devices, whereby those states could strengthen themselves to become strong enough. The governance then was concentrated on having a set of rules, a set of control systems, as it were, to enable the military to be strong, the economy to be strong, that would feed the army, feed the military, to enable it to defeat all the others, and then bring about the unification of China, what was known to be China. And those people brought in something called Fa, which is law. And we call them today, as opposed to the Confucians, the legalists, because they represented law. And that law was not simply a mirror of government, as I would later on suggest that history was supposed to be, but in fact was the instrument of government. That is the essential tool by which a ruler can successfully bring all the people together, win all the victories, enable the unification of the empire. And a bunch of legalists developed a whole set of writings. Incidentally, the man who inspired them, the first man who inspired them, was actually one of the disciples of Confucius, but a man who took had a slightly different emphasis from Confucius, emphasis on morality, governance, good, caring rulers, who really brought, as it were, prosperity and harmony to the people through the minimal use of violence, minimal use of pressure and control. That was a Confucian ideal. Xunzi, one of his disciples, thought that was not enough. And they have a long argument, and I won't go into that. But out of Xunzi's disciples came these people who brought together all the administrative rules that had been devised by different states in order to make their states strong, and then worked out the philosophical foundations of why this was essential and why laws were absolutely necessary if any ruler is to be successful. And the essence of it is very simple. The essence of it simply was, to go back to my point about law being man-made, the person who makes the laws was the ruler himself. He was the man who made the laws, and he was therefore above the law. And that was essential to the underlying ideas of the legalists who were so successful in the 3rd century. And over the period of about 5 or 6 decades, they actually succeeded, one after the other, to destroy all the other states and bring about the unification of the empire. The laws are very harsh. The idea was that the law should be very harsh, but they should be very explicit. You should spell it all out, very explicit, and the punishments are very explicit and very harsh. Idea being that once it is very clear what those harsh punishments are like, it will be a deterrence for all crime. Everybody will know what not to do because the punishments are so severe. And the emperor will be utterly ruthless, merciless in exercising the law, with one exception, the emperor himself being above the law. So that was the essence of, I'm oversimplifying, but that's the essence of the legalist victory over the Confucian soft approach towards governance. This dynasty, Qin dynasty, didn't last long and was overturned by the Han dynasty. Within a few decades, it was over. And the Confucians who survived, incidentally, we all know about famous stories about Qin Shi Huang burning all the books. And the books he burnt were all the books pertaining to Confucian ideas of soft governance, what it could be in our terms today, it was soft governance, as opposed to the hard, real necessities of political control that they believed in. And in so doing, a lot of those Confucian texts were literally destroyed. And they were only manuscripts anyway, written on bamboo slips and so on, and they were just destroyed. So Confucianism was then transmitted almost entirely orally for the next two or three generations. But nevertheless, a body of very loyal believers kept the thing going. And so when the Qin dynasty fell and the Han dynasty came back, the lesson they learned was that the laws were too harsh, and therefore the people couldn't accept it. And therefore, the legalist approach was ultimately too extreme and had to be replaced by something better, something softer. And they looked for something softer. There was a time of what they call many philosophical schools, and the Han rulers tried them all out, and eventually came to the conclusion that the Confucians offered the best solution to their needs. And by 100 years after the Han dynasty, they brought back the Confucians, or the surviving Confucians. There were not that many left, you can imagine, but there were some left. They were brought back, and they more or less through their own traditional transmission methods restored the Confucian teachings as they knew it, with all kinds of modifications which I won't go into. But the essential part of it was that what Confucius taught in the 6 classics that I mentioned that Confucius put down as being essential for good governance, 3 of them are actually historical. The Book of Documents, which is absolutely crucial, they were the book of documents of all those previous emperors, from ancient mythical legendary rulers down to the Zhou dynasty, all the documents supposed to have been left by them about what good governance required. So that was number 1, and it was a volume of documents, reconstructed perhaps by many generations of thinkers, and probably even reconstructed by a bunch of Confucian scholars thereafter, to some extent, and maybe even Confucius himself. We don't know, because the original texts are not with us. What we have are later transmitted texts. But nevertheless, that's in fact basically history. It's a history of documents. The second book of poetry, which we would call poetry, were also interpreted as of historical relevance, because the poetry represented the feelings of the people about their rulers. A lot of it wasn't, but nevertheless, they were interpreted that way, that the feelings of either happiness or sadness or joy or of understanding nature, understanding the world, represents and communicates the feelings of the people under a particular ruler. And when the ruler is a good ruler, people express themselves in one way. The rulers are bad, the poetry comes out different ways. So even the poetry was somehow representing some historical sensibilities about the past, about their rulers. But that I wouldn't call it history. But the first one was. The third one was Li, the book of Li. Li is a word that is extremely difficult to translate. In fact, all these words, if I may, I don't want to go into them, all these words are very difficult to translate into different languages. Li has been often translated as rites, R-I-T-E-S, or rituals, rites, ceremonies, but it doesn't communicate it. Li actually means a set of behavioral guidance, rules for behavioral guidance, proper relationships defined very carefully by Li, the relationship between people. Two people, ruler, the subject of course, but also among the subjects themselves, how they relate to each other, have to conform to certain sets of behavioral patterns which are set down. And they explicitly say they are set down because they are drawn from previous example, from precedents. It's precedent, one thing leading to another, then you have this body of Li, which then provides all the things that are necessary for a harmonious society to be ruled. So Li, in fact, again, draws upon historical precedent in all its efforts. The fourth one did not survive, so we do not know what it actually said. It was a book of music. But according to Confucian interpretations of it, that was to enable us to understand that there are certain, and this is probably closer to certain natural laws that we talk about, that music, the relationship between sounds and all that are measurable, they are universal, they are applicable at all times. And they ultimately, if handled harmoniously, bring peace and good thoughts to people. And music is essential to show that a ruler and the state understands the proper, correct relationships between nature and man, heaven and earth, and all that. I won't go into that. But anyway, that was lost. So we don't have it. We don't know what exactly was there. The fifth one was probably the most important, and that is the chronicles of the Spring and Autumn Annals. They actually represent only the annals, the kind of annual statements of what happened each year. Nothing spectacular, simply a record of what happened each year. For the state of Lu, that is Confucius' own state, which is a tiny little state, which is far from being powerful, a very weak state, but he had the record of what happened during that state. And by using the records, he used the records to explain how the state was ruled, and directly or indirectly indicated his approval or disapproval of what was done. And out of that chronology came three sets of commentaries which gave the story of what each event basically represented in the interstate relations of the time. To what extent it represented morality of the ruler, to what extent it represented the system of rule, the bureaucratic system that was employed, the control system that was employed. All these were spelt out in a set of commentaries. Now, I mention this importance because what the Confucians then brought to the Han Dynasty was a set of classics which drew, at least half of it was drawn from historical precedent, historical documents, and the principles of what to preserve to transmit the correct approach towards good governance. And that was then taken as the model by which the Confucians were employed by the Han emperors thereafter. And today, of course, we have assumed that the Confucian principles of government were the basis of government from Han dynasties down to 1911, when the Qing state finally collapsed and the Confucian state was brought to an end with the coming of the Republic of China in 1912. We assumed that those 2,000 years it was Confucian principles. But this isn't quite so. Because if it was true, then we would have had the same text, as it were, transmitted for those 2,000 years. But it was not true because, as I pointed out to you, nobody could be sure about the authenticity of the text. And it was a source of great controversy, argument for most of those 2,000 years, among the Confucians themselves, and as well as among critics of the Confucian canon, who suggest that most of it was all made up later on. So the controversies have gone on for a long time. So although the principles of Confucian government was always couched in terms of those classics, what actually happened was that the transmission was done through historical records. Now, this brings me to just to come nearer to the present, to what the Chinese saw as a body of total human knowledge. I once compared this Chinese classification of knowledge to the Library of Congress classification of knowledge, and there wasn't much that was in common. You would expect that. But to sum it up very simply, the Chinese brought all knowledge under 4 categories. And this was devised gradually over about 1,000 years before it was finally agreed to, that Jing, the Confucian classics, would represent the principles, abiding principles of all good governance, would be Jing. That would be one category by itself. The second category they call 史, which today we translate as history. And this is why I come back to the word history, why it is so difficult for the Chinese to use history in quite the same way that we understand it today. The Shi body of knowledge is an extraordinarily large body of knowledge. Incidentally, all these four categories are very large bodies of knowledge. Shi is one category. And it consists not of history as we understand it, it consists of all the documents that have been preserved to represent successful governance of the previous dynasty to be transmitted to future dynasties. This is at least the underlying idea. It was based ultimately on drawing upon those records that Confucius had selected to be preserved from ancient times, and then updated, as it were, dynasty by dynasty, with what was done by each successful dynasty, how the principles should be modified, improved on, updated, enlarged to encompass greater responsibilities, a larger empire, larger numbers of people, all the problems that have emerged from each dynasty as they face enemies from outside, conquerors from outside, Chinese rebellion from inside, all sorts of problems the rulers have had to face, and the lessons learnt. And as they are learnt, they are embodied into a new set of documents selected to tell the people and the officials and the rulers to come how to deal with these problems. So they are examples of practice, you might say, but they're also examples of how contemporary interpretations of the principles of good governance that the Confucians had brought in, how they were interpreted in practice with each dynasty. And in practice, it is explained, as it were, or set out in terms which are embodied in sets of regulations, laws, rules, and all the important documents that reveal the principles of government at its best, as it were, selected carefully by the professionals involved. And these professionals were the Shiguan, they were might be called a history profession, but they were not historians that we mean by historians. They were the people who were given the responsibility to ensure that the best things of that particular governance is preserved, carefully selected, correctly selected according to the right principles, and then transmitted to the future. And that's what I meant by a mirror for government, a mirror of good governance. And that's the role of the historian, to provide that mirror for future rulers and mandarins and officials to learn from, to enable, to ensure the future rule should be even better and make further advances. The underlying principle, again, as I said, everything is man-made by the rulers and by the officials responsible. They can be unmade, they can be reinterpreted to suit future conditions. There are no rules about being absolute. You can go on, you can make changes because they are man-made. That runs through it, and nobody questions the fact that each ruler in each dynasty can remake and unmake the rules that don't suit them, make new rules that will suit them better, and then, if those rules prove to be right, to ensure that they are further transmitted. That's the job. And this is the profession of the historian as recorder. Where it comes close to our idea of history was that those recorders of these records, as those who keep the records and make sure they're preserved, have the responsibility of making sure that they're authentic. And they have historical, as it were, principles of how to determine how each document should be preserved and selected, and how to ensure that the documents have greater authenticity and not, as it were, false in any way. All these, I don't want to go into the details of this, but there is a job there. And the historian's job is to ensure authenticity and make sure that no false lessons are learned, no mistakes are made in the text which would embarrass the rulers or be, in fact, transmitting the wrong message to the future. So there are normative principles guiding how these records are kept, but the authenticity of the records are supposed to be left in the hands of these professionals who are responsible. That's how it's been transmitted. Now, where does law come in under there? I told you the legalists had ensured the success of an empire that brought the whole thing together. And the Han Dynasty, while they learned the lesson that laws that are too harsh will be rejected by the people, nevertheless recognized that these laws cannot be simply set aside. They were valuable instruments to enable the empire to be put together. As much as possible, they should be kept as a framework for how government should be run, but they be run by people who are not blindly following any set of rules, but who have a set of moral principles drawn from the Confucian ideals of an ideal government in the past to enable these laws to be practiced in such a way that people will find them acceptable and not reject them the way they rejected them when they brought down the Qin dynasty earlier on. So there was a kind of give and take, keeping the laws on the books, but employing a set of officials and mandarins who would exercise the rules very carefully, selectively, and in fact as little as possible, so that they can provide, as it were, a different kind of rule while the laws remain intact. So laws, instead of becoming the central pillar of governance, became sidelined into a set of rules which helped, assisted governance, but not as a basic principle of rule. The governance must come from rulers who know what to do, how to behave properly, follow all the rituals that I mentioned, all the li, all the ceremonial, ritualistic part of it all the sacrifices that had to be performed, all laid down to show a reverence for morality, a reverence for good governance, a reverence for the ancestors, all sorts of other things that I won't bring into, but simply the soft aspects of human relations which make it possible for human beings to live with each other peacefully without fear and without a sense of being under control and under supervision all the time. To get this balance was what the Han Dynasty achieved. And this remained the underlying principles of what they call Confucian government. It was Confucian government in terms of the ideals and norms that they wanted to practice, but at the base there was sets of law. But the law was never given any prominence, and in the historical records, the set of laws is only a very small part of that knowledge, what I call that 1/4 of the knowledge of all human knowledge was under the word history. All of that encompassed so many other things of which the idea of law itself was minimal and just kept there as it were institutionally necessary but not to be depended on. And insofar as law was concerned, it was, you might say, just a tool, an instrument for certain purposes, of limited purposes, used as little as possible. But depending on the norms, which then place the emphasis on good governance, on a whole hierarchy of relationships, starting with the emperor and the subject in the abstract, but down below in the hands of large clans, you might say, lineages, the Chinese idea of lineage, what we might use family, but family is too small because we are too used to small nuclear families, but large extended clans. And each clan is to be self-sufficient and have its own rules about proper behavior within the clans, and they have autonomy as far as the state is concerned to perform the norms. These norms are set out in the Confucian principles. The Confucian principles are not only ruler and the subject, but among the subjects, each subject is relationship with each other, the reciprocities of family relationship within the clan, all these are certain ideals are set out. And the ideal government is when the state itself does the least, backed by a set of laws which can serve when necessary, backed by the military, which defends the country and brings about law and order, and backed by a system of tax collection revenues to enable the state to have the funding, as it were, to defend the empire. But minimal rule. The rest of it is left to the autonomous lineages and clans, family rules, guided by the heads of families, so in a way decentralizing all rules to the lineages. And relationship between the lineages all are to conform to certain sets of behavioral patterns which are approved of and regarded as moral and socially harmonious, will not disturb the order of the empire, so to speak. And only when it fails, then the Mandarin resorts to the law. The law is brought out only when these normative relationships between the lineages fail, and they can't agree. They can't come to some negotiated or adjudicated solution. Then you bring in the law, and the law is very harsh, and it remains very harsh. To bring in the law means you have failed. You have forced the government, forced the state to use an instrument that they unwillingly use to try and solve a problem which you should have solved yourself. I'm setting it out, the ideal as the Confucians understood good governance. Now, in that kind of good governance system, law is of minimal importance and is a last resort, as it were, when everything else fails. The good governance part is the transmission of the right ideas, the right principles, as seen in all the records that have been preserved. And that is history, the records that have been preserved. And the relationship is very interesting today. Now, let me come. I've given you a very simple outline of what in the past. Why is it still relevant today? It's still relevant because when the empire collapsed in 1912 and the republic was established in 1912, a whole generation of Chinese thought that the Chinese civilization was gone, and we now really have to start afresh and start with the new modern ideas that came from science and technology, from capitalism, from the West, the successful great powers of the empires, the national empires that destroyed the Chinese imperial heritage. And now all they have to be learned in order to survive, in order to fight back and defend the country from being totally destroyed. So the abandonment or the attempt to abandon the heritage and start afresh became the main battles among the intellectuals and scholars of the 20th century. And to cut a long story short, summarized in most previous terms, it is a set of standards drawn from the liberal West, capitalist economies, and what made the great British Empire succeed, the French, the Japanese, the American empire succeed as one alternative, and the other alternative when the young people rejected that and turned to the Soviet Union because of the success of the Russian Revolution, and turned to Lenin, Stalin, and the Soviet model. And essentially that was the battle that they fought for 50 years until the Chinese Communist Party won in 1949. And then they set out to take the Soviet model as their starting point. But underlying it all, where law and history was concerned, they faced the same problem. If all that history is of no relevance and all that law is nonsense, we have to start again. You start again by copying Western law, and they studied it. They took the civil code, Napoleonic code, as opposed to the common law, and they took it very seriously, that one set. But when the Chinese Communist Party won, they took the socialist law, Soviet socialist law, to replace the older Napoleonic code that they drew from both partly France, partly Germany, learning it through the Japanese. But that was resolved by the Chinese Communist Party after 1949, but it turned out not to work at all. The idea of rewriting Chinese history completely, either in liberal capitalist terms or in Soviet class struggle terms, turned out to be completely unacceptable and in fact unconvincing to ordinary people. And to this day, they haven't really quite resolved it. In 1980, 1978, when Deng Xiaoping turned the whole thing round away from the Maoist Mao Zedong's rather romantic revolutionary ideals of copying the Soviet Union and taking on the whole of the revolutionary class struggle interpretation of history, all that was rejected and they tried afresh. So the last for 50 years, you see a new generation of historians growing up in China, learning whatever they can from the historical writings of the outside world, the new global history, as it were, that is developed elsewhere. The Chinese have adopted it as a new way of approaching their history, but again, with tremendous difficulty in accepting it. They accept it as a method of studying history, but they can't see how the Chinese historical heritage that they had fits into this global history that is now being worked out elsewhere. And that remains a matter of tremendous controversy in China today. At this very moment, there are still, among all the top scholars who are arguing about this, unresolved question of where is China, what is China, where does it stand in this global history that is being worked out elsewhere, how it fits in. And they really cannot quite see how it fits in. And the reason for it is very simple, because the heritage of the 2,000 years of history as a body of knowledge that I mentioned earlier on has not been forgotten. And it is quite extraordinary to what extent the histories of the 2,000 years history have survived in the minds of practicing historians today. And of course, the historians don't have the last say, as you might expect. It's the state, the government, the Chinese Communist Party that has the last say as to how to interpret their past. And what we see today is the Chinese Communist Party, having rejected the liberal Western global capitalist economy interpretation of global history, and also the Leninist, Stalinist, even Marxist interpretation of history, having not accepted either of them in their original form, nevertheless have taken a lot from both and have tried to fit in, to reconnect that with their own traditions of history of the 2,000 years before 1912. They can't do it very easily, and in fact, they are still struggling with it, and as I mentioned, it continues. But nevertheless, how they're doing it is reflected in how the Chinese state and its particular leadership today is responding to this problem. Let me illustrate it in this way. The Chinese history that was transmitted for 2,000 years, the key to it, the foundations of it, was in what they call the standard histories. Every dynasty was followed by every other dynasty, as it were, in a continuity which stretched from the Qin-Han unification down to 1912, in theory. And each dynasty continued through references to the past to enable it to devise principles for governing the future. And this has continued. And they read the transmission of these standard histories as a continuity of the heritage, which has been the secret of China's success. It has proven that the Chinese civilization is resilient because it learned from the past, and each time it learned, it would rise again from periods of chaos and disorder, so that there is no fear that Chinese civilization would fail altogether. It can fall, it can recover, and it can rise again. And that is proven by those historical continuities of the past. And this gives them confidence that a China that has fallen can rise again. And the secret of it is to enable you to reconnect with that past, to make sure that that resilience, the spirit of resilience, the spirit of being able to recover from periods of chaos and disorder remains there, and can provide the means whereby the state rises again. And what I think, and I'll I'll bring it to a close in this way. The last few weeks we've seen a change of the Constitution again, and as I mentioned before, a Constitution is simply a tool in the background. It is not a means of good governance, it's simply a tool. You change the Constitution like the Chinese idea of law, also that has been preserved. That tradition is still alive. You treat the law as an instrument of the state, man-made, man can be remade and can be remade. And they've done that by changing the rules to enable Xi Jinping to continue. I'm just using one example, there are many other aspects of it, just to show that it confirms that it's the ruler, and in this case, the ruler is not one man, the ruler is the Chinese Communist Party. The Chinese Communist Party represents the emperor of China, the ruler of China. The ruler is above the law. The ruler changes the law to suit its purposes, and then it reconnects with all the traditions of the past. And how does it reconnect? It's very important to see what Xi Jinping has said in the last 5 years, for example. From the time he came on board, the first thing he said was, we must learn from what failed in the Soviet Union, what made the Soviet Communist Party fail. He started with that. But then he went backwards. What was wrong with the period, the early years of the Chinese Communist rule under Mao Zedong? And what was wrong about in the past, further? And step by step, he goes backwards. And what he's able to say, and he has said it several times, Deng Xiaoping was successful and brought China to its present state because he learned from the mistakes of Mao Zedong. And Mao Zedong made a lot of mistakes, but Mao Zedong's greatness did not come from the time he was the ruler of China, but from the time he was a revolutionary leader that led to the Communist Party victory. And how did he win? He won by tremendous sense of discipline in the party, uniting the party, serving the party with a very high sense of ideal and dedication, people who are willing to live and die for the ideals of the revolution. And this is what he turns to. Not the mistakes of Mao have been learned by Deng, but the greatness of Mao was the fact that he made the party such a successful party and won the final war. And before that, what was wrong with the regimes before? What happened to the Republic of China that was founded by Sun Yat-sen? What was wrong with that? It was because they had no leader, no strong leader. Sun Yat-sen himself, as a leader in 1912, realized that he was too weak to run the country. He surrendered it to Yuan Shikai because he had no party, no military to speak of. So what was his lesson? His lesson was that to be successful ruler of China, you must be strong, you must have your own army, you must have a party that is absolutely loyal to the leader. And that was actually Sun Yat-sen's message. We think of him now as somehow associated with the liberal Kuomintang's link up with the American ideals of governance. But actually Sun Yat-sen's own message just before he died was to unite the party and build a party army along the lines of the Soviet Red Army. He modeled that, he used that as a model for his revolutionary army, but he died before that, and there was no leadership. A fight among the leaders of his successors simply dissipated all that he had worked for, and although they made him into the father of the republic and so on, there were no way and means of controlling the country after that. The lesson was, and this is the lesson Xi Jinping is drawing upon, and I think he's not alone, the lesson was that China will always need a strong, united leadership. And the leadership may be one man, but certainly the leadership must be a united Communist Party in modern terms. And I think this is what links him back. And here's the problem. This is where I think history becomes very important, very interesting link, because as I said, the tradition was 2,000 years of connected, continuous history down to the time when it collapsed, and then now the rise of China linking back. But there is a problem, because in the 1840s, when the West finally broke into China and opened up China, they actually caused the Chinese people to rewrite the history in one sense. they took the Western chronology of what is modern and what was pre-modern or what is medieval as their basis for rewriting the history. And they took their modern history to start from 1840, when the West broke in the opening of China in the treaty ports. And thereafter, in fact, down to the present, all the historians take as modern history starting from 1840. And there's a disconnect between that idea of modern history and those 2,000 years earlier on, because they couldn't explain the fact that there was the standard histories stopped at the Ming Dynasty, and the Qing Dynasty did not have a standard history that was accepted. And let me just briefly say this. The Qing Dynasty conquered China. The Manchus conquered China in 1644, set up the Qing Dynasty, and it lasted till 1912 when it fell, and the whole dynastic system was abandoned. All the history up to 1644 are accepted as standard history, providing the continuities of the 2,000 years before. 1840 becomes the beginning of a modern history, which then retells, as it were, the new China starting from 1840. But what they have not been able to do, and in the Chinese official mind, as I see it today, they still are obsessed with it, was how do you deal with that Qing history from 1644 to 1912? They tried to write it. It's quite interesting. In the 1920s, the survivors of the Qing dynasty tried to write a Qing history to try and ensure the continuities of Chinese history. They wrote it so badly, it was not accepted. The Kuomintang government, after they came to power, and then even when they went to Taiwan, tried to rewrite a Qing history, not accepted because it just didn't cover the right story, didn't tell the right story, didn't fit in fact. And what one would have thought was totally unnecessary if they really have adopted the new way of looking at the world is to forget about it. They have not. Ever since, there have been a body of historians in China with the backing of the government to try and write the history of the Qing dynasty, an official history of the Qing dynasty for the period 1644 to 1912. It contradicts actually the modern history that is been rewritten now over the last 100 years from 1840 onwards. It contradicts that. And as far as I know, the government of China is aware of that, but nevertheless feels that that gap has to be filled. And for one very simple reason, if no other, that the inability to fill that gap will make it impossible to reconnect with that past fully. And until and unless they can reconnect fully, that sense of continuity of Chinese history that has explained China's fall and rises, successes and failures for so long, and proved the resilience of Chinese civilization would not be complete. There'd be a missing link, as it were, in that story, which would not make that story totally believable. And this is, I think, what remains very much in the minds of the leaders. Why Xi Jinping today sounds so much more confident than he said it and his predecessors, that China has risen, I think is related to the fact that he is making a really strenuous effort to reconnect with that past as much as possible. I'm told from my latest informants that the history of the Qing dynasty in something like 100 volumes will be published very shortly. In other words, they have done it. How they've done it, I have no idea, because we've not seen it yet, but apparently the team of hundreds of scholars who have been asked to do this since about officially designated to do this about 20 years ago, and they're now apparently about to be complete. I'm interested in it as a historian to see how they do it. But it reflects that great concern to see true continuity with the past, to make it real. And Xi Jinping seemed to have reached a point when he's confident that this connection, this reconnection, has now succeeded. And let me sum it up in this way, and I'll end on this. I'm sorry I've taken so long. I'll end on this. He is confident because I think China has finally reached a point when they know at least they think they know, what they can learn from the West and what they don't have to learn from the West. Until recently, they really were debating and unsure. They must learn everything, or they must learn very little. But now I think they are sure what they have to learn. Something like 80% of it they can learn from the West, maybe 90% even. No question, science and technology, no question, absolutely. The laws of finance and capitalism and entrepreneurship and industrial, no problem. They can learn all that. And they have learned all that. They have mastered it. Even law. I think they've learned something about international law. They know how the United Nations works. They know how to make sure that international regulations and the international norms can be used to serve their purposes. And when it serves their purposes, they use it very successfully. And they have done so now systematically. And they're getting better at it all the time. So that what they need to learn, they know. I think they now know, as I said, 80 to 90% they learn. What they don't have to learn, they also know. They have now in their own minds determined the areas where there'll be a line drawn. This is not necessary for China. We don't need that. And that's also been spelled out very clearly in some of the practices that are introduced in China today, where they seek control over certain things. Mind you, there's a lot of gray areas. Let me say that this is not as clear, sharply clear-cut as all that. But nevertheless, in their minds, they at least know where the borders are. And these are the border areas, the gray areas, plus the definitely no entry areas are being sorted out in the minds. And this is, I think, what gives Xi Jinping confidence. With knowledge that they can master, if not already mastered, all the principles that are necessary for China's future, and what is not necessary, they can keep out, or to a large extent keep out, is what makes him very confident today. Let me end with three very simple examples of how this question of law and history does remain relevant to China. The law is in the background of use when necessary, can be used when necessary, but ultimately it is that connecting with the past which gives the civilization its strength and its confidence, and for people to have their self-respect once again. And the three examples I give are as follows. What we saw, for example, in the disputes over the South China Sea, just one very specific example, they have never really disputed the laws about the sea. What they have disputed is a particular approach to the judiciary, to the adjudication group in the Netherlands, in The Hague, to want to determine a particular set of things. They've objected to that on the grounds that it is not necessary or is not covered by the United Nations law of the sea that they had signed. This is controversial, and I'm not sure what is right and wrong. I don't know enough about the law to know what is right or wrong. But what I think is interesting is that they have not rejected the law, they've accepted the law, but they are now able, at least in their minds, to pick out the things which they say don't really necessarily fit into that law, and argue about that and reject it quite clearly and vigorously rejected it. That's one example of how they have accepted the law, but use it, as I always said, as a tool of their needs, but not as something absolute. The second example is the way they have recently again changed the Constitution. I don't know how many times they've modified the Constitution. I lost count now. From the time they had a new set of Constitution in 1912, when the Republic was set up, they have modified the Constitution innumerable times. And all of that, I think, and the recent one is very simple. They changed the rules for a whole set of things, which was just done by the National People's Congress just a few days ago, it ended a few days ago. And they essentially showed that in the interest of good governance, or in the interest of the powers of the state, all these laws, constitution or otherwise, all set, every part of it can be modified and changed accordingly where it fits the national interest of the country. They've done that. Again, simple tool. Nothing absolute about the law, man-made, changeable. And the third one I think of particular interest to me, and that is that there's an assumption that we can apply the same principles of law everywhere. And I found this particularly interesting in a set of published things called the Rule of Law Index. And they publish that every year, I think last few years. The latest one I saw was for 2017, I think. And it lists 113 countries to what extent they follow the rule of law. And the rule of law, of course, is defined in a way which the Chinese have no way of translating it. And when it comes out in Chinese, it's certainly more like rule by law than rule of law. But nevertheless, that index has been used internationally. And China fits in something like number 75 in the 113. Starts with Denmark, a wonderful country, right at the top. It goes down. And somewhere number 75, and in the terms of the score, the top score is 80-something, and the bottom score is, I think, 20-something. I've forgotten anything. I think it's Venezuela or something down at the bottom. But China has about 50. I thought that was very strange. 50 means 50-50. So it's it's half empty or half full, depending how you see it. But the fact that you could actually find criteria to fit China in, I think is extremely interesting. In other words, outside, we're applying a set of rules about where law stands, and we fit China in. From the inside, I don't think the Chinese understand it at all. In fact, I can't actually see how the Chinese understanding of their law and the place of law in their historical continuity fits into this rule of law index. But I use that to illustrate the gap between our understanding of what law means in terms of even the limited sense of state legitimacy, as it were, and the state application of the law, what that means to China and the West, how that fits in here. When we make an assumption like that the Chinese position in all this can be measured in one set of rule of index, is in itself illustrative of the kind of problems that China faces as it tries to make itself part of a new global order. I think I better stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. So we have to invite Professor Yuno to the stage, and then two fellows, right? Yeah. Please. Have an open discussion. Thank you.
Oh,
I just want to show you, these are my comments.
Okay, please tell your comment.
Good morning, nice meeting you, nice joining you. And I want to keep to the laws of this meeting. I was told the fellows are first.
Okay, thank you for that fascinating book. I have a couple of questions I wanted to ask. One is from the very beginning. You mentioned that there wasn't the same role for God or religion in the kind of development of Chinese government and culture the way there has been in other parts of the world. And I was curious about how that feeds into the concept of law. I was curious about how that feeds into the concept of law as it applies to laws in science. Because the kind of standard view about laws in science is that there's a kind of metaphor involved of the laws that govern a country being formed by a government. So the laws of nature are formed by a god to govern nature. And so I was curious as to whether you think that there's a kind of different attitude to science that comes out of having not having this metaphor of laws in play. And the second question was about how... Oh, yeah? How would you like to do this?
Let is big discussion.
So one at a time, in other words. You leave your second question. I have a mic. I think you're quite right to say that. In fact, when I came to my conclusions about the Chinese have no difficulty about laws of science and technology, and the 80–90% that they can accept, in fact, is the laws of science and technology, is because the Chinese now understand it or see it as those laws are laws of nature, got nothing to do with gods or and not made by some other person or some other imaginary person. They are there, and it doesn't contradict what they have understood from their relationship with the cosmos and their own assumptions, premises about the relationship between man and nature, man and the heavens. The Chinese fundamental starting point in their understanding of the universe is that there is Tian, which is a cosmos, kind of cosmic force. There's Di, which is earth, everything on this earth, and man, the agency, as it were, caught between, as it were, Tian and Di, heaven and earth. And the man's responsibility is trying to relate to that Tian and to relate to the Di. And I think they have come to the conclusion that the science of the laws of science and so on are its relationship with both Tian in the abstract, and on the ground, what you find on the field, what you find in the resources on the earth, as it were, provides you with the concrete evidence of the truth of the relationship with the cosmos, as it were. And they find that, oh, that's fine, that's okay. There's nothing. And that is not human. That's not man-made. They accept that because that's beyond man. That's Tian and Di. In the triangular relationship, the superiority of the cosmic forces and the superiority of the natural forces on this earth are taken for granted. Man is not superior to them. Man is subject to all of that. But in the past, and their attempt to, and this is where they brought in history to, as it were, play down the law. History is entirely man-made anyway, and the law I've also assumed to be man. They're dealing with those aspects which are man-made. And where man-made things are concerned, they dispute who has the right to do that. And the idea that there's a supreme leader, a ruler, who makes the law and is above the law has been accepted by them. And this is, of course, today we reject that whole idea. We just don't think. But the Chinese still believe that that is still essential for the survival, and in fact explains the resilience of China, is because they do have this kind of one strong leader providing a strong guiding hand to ensure success and resistance.
Sure. Anya, do you want to go?
You had a second
okay.
question.
Yeah, okay. So the second question kind of flips us back to a talk from the beginning of the week. So the other historian we have here, Professor Geary, was talking about laws in history as kind of supposedly universal principles that you might use to explain historical development, and he was very skeptical about the idea of such principles. And you also expressed skepticism about very general principles that might govern all of human history. But you seemed open to the idea that within China, and maybe also within kind of Western history, there might be laws that were explanatory of developments that were kind of universal patterns within that restricted domain. So, I mean, do you think we really can find universal principles there, or are they all subject to exceptions eventually?
I can think of no Chinese text or tradition that would say there would be laws that govern human beings. They've not used the word law in that sense anyway. At least I've never come across that. But they have an idea of what is normative. And that it may not be the same thing as law, but what is the norm? For example, I mean, one of the nearest things to a law in history, I don't know whether Professor Geary agrees or not, is the idea that power corrupts and power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. To me, it's not a law. The Chinese would not see that as a law, but that's the nearest thing to a normative principle, which you should pay attention to. Then otherwise it will happen. You know, I think the Chinese have a lot of those. But they use what they call, I would say, analogies rather than law. there was something happened in the past. It provides you with something that would alert you to what can happen if you don't learn from that, or if you do what that was done in the past, you'll end up the same way or something like that. Now, I don't think the Chinese would apply the word law to it, but they would agree that, for example, if you're a bad ruler, you'll be overthrown and have your throat cut or something like that. That's a sort of, is that a law? You know, but the Chinese, well, that serves you right. You see, you know that if you rule badly, you'll end badly, and if you don't learn from that, that's too bad. You know, so is that a law? To my idea, that's about as far as the Chinese would go, using an analogy from the past to tell you what to do. And you can take it seriously, you can take it partially, or whatever it is, but if you fail to take note of that, then you deserve what you get. I think that's about, as far as I can see.
Thank you.
So thanks for that very interesting talk that I thought, for one, it provided a really nice insight into history, not just being a retelling of past events, but also a narrative of current identity that goes into the future. And I wondered, or maybe because you talked about analogies, when I heard your talk and I heard your explanation of what the Qin dynasty did back then, and it's always dangerous to draw these analogies, but I felt reminded of what happened in my own country, which is, I think, 16 centuries younger than China, but you know, in Germany, Bismarck basically was probably like Qin Shi Huang in that he tried to unify a country that was basically just warring states and had been warring states for hundreds of years. And they had very strict laws, they had administration, they had infrastructure, so it seems like there are these tendencies that occur at different points in history for different countries. At the same time, my country, at least as far as I know, doesn't have any sense of continuity and, you know, this one accepted history. I mean, we've been ruled by Italians, by French, by Danes, by Russians, Americans, and so on. And there's like no sense that we need this unified narrative at all. Why do Chinese put such a lot of emphasis on having this narrative over the last 2,000 years? What does it do for them? Why is it important for them to have this, and why can't they live with the realization that, you know, history is this mosaic of different pieces that come together and don't have any logic?
That's a very good question. I have a particular understanding of this. Whether it's correct or not, I think I need to be more carefully looked at. I link it together with the difference that the Chinese have seen themselves never as a nation, but as a civilization. And therefore, the analogy of Bismarck doesn't quite fit, because that's, in a way, Bismarck was a victim of this nation-state idea which came up after the French Revolution and so on, in the post-18th century idea. And as far as I know, the Germans were quite happy with their different states before that. But then to meet with Napoleonic France, your idea was you've got to unite against to make sure the French don't do that again, because they are united and we're not. I mean, that sort of is a direct response to a particular set of circumstances. And it was based on the idea that the nation state as an instrument of political success was the greatest ever at that point. Up to that point, all these different little bishoprics or states, princely states and so, they were all so weak because each one of them was so selfishly worried about their own little interests. So you got to get all the German-speaking people together to resist this French imperialists. The Chinese have never faced that problem before. The concept of nation is really they're still struggling with it. If you look at the argument about what is China today, the essential problem is that they are now seen as a nation state in the world of nation states, 180 nation states, and China is one of them. How to behave like a nation state when they've never done it before. In the past, they saw themselves as a civilization. It's like, in a way, like the Roman Empire, Holy Roman Empire kind of thing. It's a civilization. And it's a set of norms, set of values, set of historical continuities. It has no national borders to speak of, no sense of and not even that strong sense of a oneness of a language, because they don't speak the same language. They needed a written language to unite themselves. there are now something like, still essentially about a dozen languages among the Han Chinese, completely unintelligible. In fact, even more, hundreds of them, unintelligible to each other. And only the written form is the basis of communication. So it is a civilization based on a particular written language with particular Confucian values which had no borders. For example, today you could meet Koreans and even some Japanese and some Vietnamese who would claim to be Confucians. And when the Manchus conquered China in 1644, the Korean Confucian philosophers said that now that the barbarians have taken over China, the Chinese have lost their civilization. It depends on us now to maintain the civilization. Now, so there's no question of national identification with the Confucianism. Confucianism was a set of values, and in fact, to this day, you can still meet Korean scholars who will tell you that we are more genuinely Confucians than you are, than the Chinese are. In fact, the Chinese have lost their way. They are the people who are preserving the true Confucian ideals. I mean, this is arguable, but all I'm saying is that the idea of a nation is something that the Chinese are still struggling with and really have problems with. And that is one of the reasons why this Qing history business is quite important. Because if they can succeed in getting this Qing history written and that gap filled, then it continues the idea that it is a civilization and not a nation state, because China during the Qing dynasty was ruled by the Manchus, not by the Chinese. And these Manchus were conquerors from outside of the Great Wall, conquerors, and they rule, but they rule along the same civilizational principles of Confucian rule. So what was important was the nature of the rule, not the national state. In fact, when Sun Yat-sen led the revolution and brought about the fall of the Qing dynasty, he used nationalist slogans, which he learned from the Japanese, from the Germans, and from the Americans, that the Manchus are barbarians, foreigners, aliens, and the national salvation of China is to get rid of foreign rulers. So couched in very imperialistic terms, like we colonies ought to use, get rid of the foreign invaders and to be free again. So that language is a totally alien to the Chinese tradition. And that is why Sun Yat-sen, when he introduced it, found himself in a jam. When they succeeded and established a republic, he said, hang on, the borders of China includes Manchuria, Mongolia, Tibet, and so, but they're also China. So he had to change his tune and stop using the word Minzu as he used against the Manchus, and talked in terms of we're all one family in a very multinational state, which was based on a common heritage of history. Now, so you can see how they've struggled with that, and that remains the problem. So the answer is not the same example of a nation building, but it's caught with this, that the rhetoric of nation building is now thrust into the Chinese story. Mm-hmm. And how they resolve that, I think, would be something to watch. I don't know the answer.
So if the rhetoric provides the identity, then how do they cope with the changes in the structure of society? I mean, you said that earlier there was this institutional arrangement where clans ruled their business by themselves, and the state was only exceptionally exceptionally used. The law was only used in exceptional circumstances. And now you say that the Communist Party is like the emperor used to be, but the clans are gone, right? Families are very small now, very atomized, like very small family units. The big clans aren't as prominent as they used to be. So it's sort of this, hasn't this balance been upset? And
the relationship between state and society has changed tremendously in the last 100-odd years. Before that, it was, in a way, the state was very abstract and very distant and far away. And society consists of cells of innumerable lineages which manage their own affairs most of the time and only occasionally resort to the state. The state, as it were, only maintains a few things, as I said, defense, collecting the taxes, and making sure that all the rituals and sacrifices and ceremonies are made. But the rest of the people live their own lives in their little cells. I think that part of it In a way, the nearest thing, if I can use your example, in the German language, the distinction between the Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft kind of difference helps to understand a bit. The Chinese are still very much in the Gemeinschaft kind of tradition. And the Gesellschaft thing, which gives the emphasis on the laws and relationship in a more defined sense, doesn't appeal to them. There's still elements of the Gemeinschaft traditions that are very strong in China, which needs that connection with this continuity, which is so important to them. Oh, just
So thank you. Thank you for the lecture, which was really interesting for me, as I am just a narrow-minded scientist.
Oh no, never narrow, never narrow, never narrow.
And thanks for your two very interesting comments that they shed some light on some things I didn't know. And I'm sitting here, I think, to challenge you. So all what I will say now is trying to challenge you. First of all, a very minor point that was brought up by languages, by you and by others. Having several languages does not necessarily conflict with having a nation. Switzerland, that can be a suburb of Shanghai altogether, has 3 languages. Belgium, 2, maybe even 3. Israel has 3 languages, and we are all very small. So, and these 3 countries that I mentioned feel that there is a nation behind it, that it's not just people that speak 3 languages, although they have their history, their families, and so on. So but this is a minor point. I don't know how to deal with hundreds of languages, so maybe you have a point there. India, well, now there is a question how different are China and India, and I don't want to tell my opinion about it. But China, although you say that it doesn't have a national feeling, or not enough, or has still more civilization than a country that has a point, when there are issues, international issues that China has to say something or has a vote, they always vote. They don't say we don't have an idea, we don't have a point, we don't know how to deal with it, it's not like our life. They always have a vote, and very strongly. So there is a sort of a big difference between the way we look at China, or you look at China, and the way that China behaves internationally. But this is also a minor point compared to to real issues. In your opinion, there is a connection between religion or having a god and having rules. I just want to remind you that there are sometimes conflicts between God and rules. Let's talk about Galileo. He was against what was called the laws of God, that the globe is the center of the universe and it doesn't move. Took 400 years until the church decided to celebrate his birthday. 400 years. So it's also a point. And today there is a big dispute between the creationists and the evolutionists. The creationists think that God did everything, and there is a very strong scientific activity in evolution. So just to say God, or just to say belief in God, is a little bit too little. And about borders. And this is a point that I really wanted to evaluate, talk about a little bit longer. You say that the Chinese now understand the borders between them and the world. They know this we want to do, and this This is a border. We don't want to do more than this or beyond this or into it. Did I understand you correctly?
That's what the Chinese believe. I mean, I don't share that.
No, not you, not yourself. We don't talk personally. For the Chinese belief. Well, if we look at science, and as I told you, I'm just a narrow-minded scientist. They didn't understand that there is a border, or maybe they understand, but they don't want to understand this. They are driving to prices. They think that if they do the way that they understand science, they will get prizes, and that's what's important for them, to be recognized in the world, not only to do valuable science, but to be recognized. And they do hardly anything for this. They don't teach, they don't let the young people understand English. They don't teach English, which is that scientific language. It's not a beautiful language, it's actually an ugly one, sorry. But this is used, we can't change that. So the kids there, when they finish school, what they know is to read what a Chinese decided to translate to Chinese. And this sometimes is months or years after it was discovered or it was disputed. So they don't have the tool to jump into science the way science is done now. This border they didn't pass. And they didn't pass the border of creativity. They know to do science better than anybody else. The scientific values, the scientific performance is very, very high in China and between Chinese out of China. But usually, mostly, it is repeating what somebody else did, maybe better, maybe faster, maybe more complete, but not new. And as far as I know, and I'm really busy with it a lot, with the education, scientific education in China, when they ask me what to do to get a prize, and I tell them teach English, they laugh and go. and this I think is the minimum, is to understand what science is all about. And they decided maybe this is the border, maybe I didn't understand where the border is. Maybe the border is what's done in China. But then why do they compete with the world? They do. I think that the performance is superb, best than anybody else, or almost best than anybody else, but not the questioning, the thinking, the way of approaching still unknown problems in science. So maybe somebody wants, or maybe you want to answer me.
Well, I don't know that I can answer that particular question. I think you're absolutely right. In fact, that was the central issue about learning from the West right from the beginning. Because at the end of the 19th century, there were a group of Chinese scholars who believed that all they needed to do was to learn science and technology from the West, and entrepreneurship and capitalism from the West, and they could match the West. And it turned out to be a complete failure, because as the Chinese experienced it anyway, they were so utterly humbled by the war with Japan in 1894. They completely lost confidence in their ability to do that. And the phrase they invented to try and justify what they were doing was the phrase 中体西用. That is to say, you keep the essence of Chinese values and learn the methodologies of the West to master everything, and then you'll be all right. That was the phrase, the formula that they had. And this turned out to be an illusion. And the 20th century, the whole rejection of the Confucian past from the 1910s onwards was based on this idea. They thought, yes, you have to learn everything from the West if you want to be like the West. And they had the phrase, 全盘西化, total westernization. And a whole bunch of historians, and scholars and philosophers who advocated that nothing less than that will enable you to be modern like the West. They did that. As it turned out, it failed too. It didn't work either. Somehow it just didn't. They didn't catch. The people couldn't accept it. They were not so much not able probably, but not willing to completely learn from the West. They felt that that's not the way to do. So the debates in a way between the liberals on the one hand against the communists on the other will hinge on this one. The funny thing was the liberals accused the communists of learning from the West, entirely from just copied the Soviet Union. In fact, if you read the literature of the most critical people who are anti the Mao Zedong period and so on, was that they were so stupid they wanted to copy everything from the Soviet Union, and that's why they failed. And the West, of course, in your terms, that's not the real West, but the Chinese, that is the West. They just took the heterodox West. It's not the orthodox West, the heterodox West. But they accused them of having tried to copy the West and failed utterly. Actually, Mao Zedong did not copy the West either. So I'm just illustrating the kind of arguments that the Chinese face, which is like all or nothing business. It's either all or nothing, and the halfway point, in a way, that's partly why I couldn't resist pointing out this rule of law index when the Chinese are 50, so 50 up, 50 below the level, 50 above the level. There's a halfway point. It illustrates the fundamental Chinese dilemma: to learn everything, or to learn nothing, to learn halfway. What does it mean? And they're caught with that. I suggested that they think now they're 80% there, but I'm not. I'm just illustrating why Xi Jinping sounds so confident. But I think they recognize there is a gray area, and what you point out is something I would say still the gray area, and it's been there for the last 100 years. The Chinese have never been able to deal with that because, in their heart of hearts, this undermines the very nature of the continuity of Chinese history. And that contradiction is something they're not really quite prepared to live with. I mean, that's all I can say.
So do they listen to you?
No.
Because I have an advice.
I have a comment.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe that's also a question for now, compared to Japan, the engagement with the West was started around the same time. But Japan persevered. And at the beginning, I believe that many things that the Japanese did, especially in science, were all copied. Low quality copied. Of course, there are instances of peaks.
You're right, but they changed it.
They changed it and they persevere. But at the same time, during the same period, China was beset with internal problems, a lot of political problems. And I think that I'm not sure about the history during that period of, now IU Park, of which Michel Spiro is going to be the president. The Japanese were the founding members. The China joined in 1937. And at that time, I think it was a weak nation in terms of publication, whereas Japan was gaining strength by 1937. So I'm not quite sure about the historical background during this period of between 1923 all the way to 1942. But of course, I think during this period, Japan was gaining strength, whereas China was fighting a losing battle in some sense. And I think this somewhat accounts for the scientific output. Now, the recent achievement of the Chinese were very recent in that sense. I mean, the achievement of Chinese were very recent. It's probably less than 20 years. And I think for the Chinese to gain scientific glory, we have to they need time, which is not what they have. They are now rushing into it in some sense.
So what is the question?
So my question is to that what is the historical period? I mean, I'm giving the fact that Japan was a founding member of IUPAC. In 1937, China joined IUPAC, but it was a very weak nation in terms of scientific outputs. But still, between 1937 all the way to 1970, when the People's Republic of China joined, it's a long period. And when I say China joined IUPAC, it was the Republic of China, Taiwan. So these are the historical backgrounds. So if you can somewhat think in terms of this, then you can contrast and compare why China lagged behind Japan in terms of science during this period. So I think that has got to do with history as well.
I am interested in the question that you raised, because the comparison with Japan has been one of the fundamental problems of China. Because although there are reasons why there's great enmity because of the wars between China and Japan, and the fact that Japan humiliated the Chinese so badly in the past, it was actually admiration of Japan that led them to the Republic in the first place. I mean, the whole national revolution of Sun Yat-sen was actually modeled, inspired by Japan. And the early revolutionaries were all students in Japan and wanted to follow Japan. Where it went wrong, and this is something I think is relevant, was that Japan learned from the West only too well. Because they not only learned the science, they also learned the nationalism that brought the Germans to the Bismarckian nationalism, the nationalism that led to imperialism. All that they learned too well. They wanted to do what the British did. They modeled themselves on the British Empire, or the German, or the Nazis for that matter, and they followed their nationalism to its logical conclusion, which was to expand itself onto the mainland, to in fact turn the whole of Asia into their backyard, as it were. And they did that only too well. And the Chinese were the greatest victim of that, at least in the eyes of the Chinese. The irony of it all is that it was because of the war with Japan that the Chinese developed something called nationalism. I said earlier on that the Chinese had no idea of nationalism. They had no sense of being a nation, but a very superior civilization, yes, but not a nation as such. But the Japanese success against them inspired them, and they modeled themselves on the Japanese. But what did they learn from it? They learned from the Japanese, certainly on science and technology, they followed that. But whether they have learned or not from the Japanese misinterpretation of the West to become imperialist and extend itself the way it did is still a question mark among some of the young nationalists that are loudly speaking in China today. But I think this is a very uncertain area, because the underlying thinking among the Chinese leaders is to avoid that. If you read the language of even Deng Xiaoping or Xi Jinping and so on, I think they are genuine in wanting to learn from that, never to do what the Japanese did. But to learn from science and technology, I think they admire the Japanese a great deal. They will never admit it publicly, but they are learning from it. And they will probably do what the Japanese have done, and they will eventually, I think, follow the same track where science and technology is concerned. But I hope they do not follow the Japanese track of the militarism of the 1930s and so on. And I suspect they won't. They learned that message. They learned it from both the Germans and the Japanese, not to do that, and not to fall into the Thucydides trap, as it were. They have very carefully tried to draw the line. But all these are still, as it were, work in progress. And I cannot say how they will ultimately end up, what kind of a China they'll end up with. But at the moment, I'm saying that they are confident, and I believe that they're confident that the areas that they know they can learn and will learn from the West, absolutely without question, they're confident. What they're confident also, there's an area which they don't want. They're also very confident, they've spelled it out. Whether they can succeed or not in keeping it out, I don't know. But they're confident in defining what they don't want. But there is a gray area where one influences the other, which I'm not sure yet how they will deal with. But if they follow Japan, they will probably breach that gap somewhat in a time. But they will also have their area where they will not learn from the West. And I believe this is actually also what Japan is doing. There are areas where the Japanese will not learn from the West. And the Chinese are trying to find their version of how much they can protect of their own heritage without having to learn from the West. I think this is the kind of analogy that they have in mind.
You have a question?
Thank you, Professor Wang. Your presentation is always very inspiring. Speaking to our theme, the law, you mentioned law in the Chinese history is in the hand of the leader, the emperor, as a tool. So don't you think this kind of arbitrary use of law can be very dangerous, especially in recent weeks as we see the Xi Jinping change the constitution? There's a lot of commentators already mentioned maybe we have to prepare the new coming of Red Guards or new cultural revolution. So what do you see this kind of forecast? Thank you.
I certainly hope not. not the Red Guards and Cultural Revolution again. I actually don't believe that that will happen, because I think among the things that Xi Jinping believes in is to learn from the mistakes of the past. And I think he and his whole generation recognized that the Cultural Revolution, the kind of Maoist extremism, the kind of romantic revolutionarism that Mao Zedong practiced was a mistake, a grave mistake that caused a lot of harm to China. I think there's a general understanding of that. So if they follow that line of thinking, they will not make the same mistake. But nevertheless, the question of whether their interpretation of social control, the way they are operating today, and here I have to say, we have reached a new stage in social control, because this is something I don't understand, and I think it will take some time for me to understand it, and that is the technology has changed. And this is where science has contributed towards making the problem even more difficult to foresee, because the technology that enables people to be more free can also be used to make people less free. And the state capacity to use these technologies for that purpose is unlimited, because they have the power to do so. So how they use the technology and the science that helps them to develop and master them can actually contribute towards the kind of things that we don't want to see happen in China. The mastery of the skills for social and greater social control. And I think that would be regrettable, but I'm not sure how they will do it. I think there are enough people in China who also know the dangers of that, and there's a kind of balancing struggle going on, but the future is too hard for me.
Yes, sorry.
Thank you very much for an extremely profound presentation on law and history, and I'm so glad to have another historian here and someone who can really do the job at that scale. I'm very interested in your argument that it is a search for a Qing history that is needed to stabilize the new dynasty by its relationship to a useful, appropriate past. But that then raises the stakes on who may say what that history is. And like you, I'm very curious to see what the 20-volume history of the Qing would be. And who would write this? When I was at Peking University for several weeks 2 years ago, and they have a very, very fine history department. But as one gets closer to the modern period, there are fewer and fewer people dealing with it. To the 20th century, you can't do it at all. And the 19th century is very problematic already. So it's wonderful to be in a country where history is so important that no one dare do it. But who is doing this history? Who is authorized? Is this within universities? Is this a department within the government separate? And what is the role within China of what we think of as historians in healing this gap in history that you identify so well as a problem that China has been unable to deal with over the past century? We no longer have the kind of departments in the imperial palace that used to maintain the records. So who is doing this?
You've asked a very, very important question, and it comes back to my reference to the fact that history is not what we mean by history.
Yes.
History is a body of knowledge for transmitting the past as lessons for the future. The mirror for government that I use as a short-term phrase to explain it. And therefore that history is quite clearly not done by academic historians or professional historians and so on outside the central system. So it is the central system that dictates this Qingshi, the official history that is being done. It is done in a university, group of universities. It's actually done under the heading of the Renmin Daxue. The People's University has a team of people led by a very famous scholar by the name of Dai Yi. He is actually a professional historian, but he believes that there should be a Qingshi. So he accepts the view that there should be an official standard interpretation of the years 1644 to 1912. And therefore he is now leading this team. I think there are several hundred of them working around it, but based in the Renmin Daxue People's University. And they've been working, actually they've been working for ever since you can trace back all the way, but they were officially given the task about 1999 or the year 2000, about 20 years ago. They were officially designated to write the official history of the Qing dynasty. So it's a bunch of professional historians using historical methods, but performing a role which is a traditional role of filling a gap in the continuities of Chinese history. And they're finding it extremely difficult for various reasons. And let me give you just a couple of examples to show what they're up against. For example, because the official history stopped in 1644, and modern history began in 1840, that period from 1644 to 1840, which is about 200 years, has been very badly served by Chinese historians. They don't know what to do with it. And what has happened is that Western historians have filled that gap very, very ably. And in fact, there's a group called the New Qing History Group based in Harvard, but also spread around the United States, and other Europeans have joined in to write this history between 1644 and 1840 by using not only Chinese sources, Manchu sources, Mongol sources, Russian sources, European, British, American, Jesuit, all that together. And they have a freedom to do this and roam around all these documents, which the Chinese historians have not had the chance to do to the same extent. They're now trying to catch up with that. At the beginning, when this new Qing history came out, the Chinese resisted that very strongly, to say that this is a kind of reinterpretation that puts the Manchus on top of everybody, and they're trying to devise a new kind of history for China, and therefore could not be accepted. But actually, they also recognized there was enough truth in what the New Qing historians were doing for them to rethink how to cast their Qing history in a completely new way. Now, that's why I'm saying I'm very intrigued to know how they're going to do it, because they are going to do it in the Chinese tradition, and yet they have, as professional historians, they're perfectly aware of what other historians outside have done to that same period of Chinese history. How to reconcile and how to turn it, as it were, into something that is both historically acceptable for the profession and at the same time would fit the needs of this connectivity with the past that the state would like to see. Very big problem, and I'm intrigued too.
Thank you, Professor. I thought your lecture was just wonderful. I have a question. It's based on the interest in Chinese politics and Chinese history that's now surfacing in Africa because China's presence in Africa. And one of the debates that's taking place really is the question of whether China is the new colonial master. And so the first question I have is the history of France, Belgium, the Britain, and so on. If one just took the last 200 years of history, some of what's linked to that history is the question of shame, the colonies, imperialism, and so on. Is this something that China has? I know you spoke about the various kingdoms. I imagine that there was imperialism sort of internally, if I can use that concept, and how this plays in writing the history. And the second question I have is this question of the Chinese diaspora. When you can go to the most remote parts of Africa, of South Africa, and there have been Chinese families living for a very long time. And so I imagine that the diaspora has a great impact on the question of Chinese history and contemporary identity. I don't know if you've sort of thought about that, but it's just these questions have surfaced as I was listening to you in your fascinating lecture. Thank you.
Well, that's something that's very new to us too. What the Chinese have done in Africa, as far as I can understand, is to say that they want to do business, they want to invest, they want to buy the resources that the Chinese have. They're willing to do deals with the rulers of Africa and not ask questions about their human rights or labor rights or whatever, the way the West has demanded standards which the Chinese don't worry about. Now, this is the presentation that I understand. And the idea that from this might flow a kind of new Chinese imperialism, the way the British and the French exercise their powers in Africa, is a question mark. But I have doubts about whether the analogy is correct, because I think what this explanation fails to recognize are the agencies of the African leaders themselves. Because unlike in the 19th century, when the Africans were just a bunch of tribes and helpless in dealing with the imperial powers, whether they're Belgian, French, or British, today they are nation states with leaders, and they are their own agencies. They have their own reasons for dealing with China the way they do. They may be selfish reasons, they may be other reasons of defiance. For example, I found that it was interesting to recognize that some of them were doing it so that they can show the West they don't depend on the West, that they can use the Chinese to stand up to the West and maybe ultimately force the West to do what the Chinese do, which is to invest, do business with them unconditionally. I mean, I'm just giving you an example. I think many of the interpretations fail to recognize the agency of the ruling elites in Africa today. They are a different bunch of people. I mean, I'm not thinking of just Mugabe and Zuma and all those, but just think of all of them. They really do have their own minds, and they do have what they have in mind for their countries are not what was there in the 19th century. I don't think it is possible for the Chinese to do what the British and the French and the Belgians did in the past. This is just out of the question. What they can do is to help these leaders, and they may be bad leaders for all I know, to help these leaders stay in power, and that may not be desirable. But on the other hand, some of them may be very good leaders for all I know. I mean, they seem to vary quite a bit in Africa, and some of them are very skillful in making use of Chinese capital for their purposes, developing but on their terms. And they are also benefiting from that. And what that means for the future development of Africa, the economic development, maybe the educational and ultimately scientific and technological and financial and entrepreneurial development, I do not know, but I suspect there's a different stage now in history in which the Chinese cannot, even if they wanted to, operate as the imperialists did in the 19th century.
So the last one.
My question to Irina, because, okay. Do you want to? She, okay. I have so many things to say, but I'll just restrict it to two things, because I think a lot of what you said is so fascinating and so important for us, especially as Africans. The first question I have is, you really stressed this idea of history, and you actually said it as his story at the beginning of your talk. And I was really curious to know whether there were any women in the process of the writing of the book of poets, the book of music, the book of documents. What is the role of women in this? Is there her story? Are there her stories in this narrative? And then my second question is about the impact of, or the extent to which German civil tradition influenced the legalists of the 1840s. Because if the German civil tradition influenced the legalists in the way that it influenced the rest of the world during the 1850 to 1914 period before the First World War, then there is an influence of Roman tradition, and then that would make it connected to the naturalist tradition, which would mean that the law is not just man-made, but is also influenced by a supreme, the canon, the Roman canon. Yeah, those are the two questions.
On your first question, I think the Chinese did have a matriarchal tradition in ancient times, which we have from the records. But unfortunately, Confucian scholars place very little importance on the role of women in the abstract. Where the women have power is as mothers. And the idea of filial piety, at least as the Confucians understood that, does not distinguish between the sexes. Your filial piety is both to your father and to your mother equally. And in some ways, the Chinese recognize the reality that children love their mothers far more than their fathers. Their fathers are distant, their mothers care and mean much more to them. So they also have that. All that is a natural phenomenon, I think, everywhere else. So that equality of women as father and mother is the only protection that the women have had in the patriarchal system that the Confucians have established. But it is a kind of a loophole, as it were, in the system, which allows the woman, provided she lives long enough, to be powerful. If you survive your husband and you become a grandmother, you become the most powerful woman in the clan. I mean, we're talking about the genealogies, in the lineages. Because the filial piety does not differentiate between the sexes, the grandmother can become the head of the clan if the husband dies. But you have to live long enough. And the way things were in China, in the way the Chinese system developed, it was not necessarily true, because women died of childbirth, because there was no such thing as safe sex or anything like that, and women did not live long enough. And unlike today, the whole medical revolution has changed it altogether. But in China, this was not always true. And the thing is that being a grandmother, if you're not the husband of the major member of the clan, doesn't give you that much power either. It gives you only a limited power for your nuclear group. But for the lineage, you have to be grandmother, and your husband must be head of the clan to have real power. And that does happen. And so occasionally, the Chinese imperial system has allowed that. You've heard of the Empress Dowager. Well, there were a couple of others before that also. And that was because the woman was smart enough and lived long enough with the right husband to inherit the kind of power that enables the woman to overcome the Confucian patriarchal system. So I'm afraid that is the only way out. And to this day, I was just having, someone was complaining to me of the fact that of the 23 Politburo members of the Chinese Communist Party, there's only one woman. 1 out of 23 is not good enough. By world standard, that's in the rule of index, we're right down at the bottom, I think. So that's the first one. For the second one, it comes back to this question of nationalism. I hate to oversimplify, but I can't stop that. It's a nation state, which is really a very new thing. I mean, to my mind, I don't know whether you agree or not, but to me, the first nation state in the world was the Dutch nation state when they freed themselves from the Spanish Empire. And that was the first one, but it was very small and it wasn't that inspiring. But when the French Revolution and the American Revolution created the kind of republic against the monarchies of the past, that republic that created a nation of citizens with equal rights and so on, that was revolutionary. But it's very new. That is a true nation state. It's not only just common language and so on, but it's the rights of the citizenry to participate in the nation. That is a really revolutionary thing. I think it started with the Dutch, but perfected in a way in France and United States. For all its faults and so on, that was where it emerged. And that is what inspired the Sun Yat-sen and the revolutionaries in China. It's one of the paradoxes of history, that what inspired Sun Yat-sen most of all was the fact that he was educated in Honolulu under the British, but he admired the Americans there. He was greatly influenced by the French Revolution and the American Revolution. They gave him the primary ideas of what a modern nation of citizens ought to be. And then he discovered that the Chinese were not ready for it. In fact, his major complaint in his old age was that the Chinese are hopelessly disunited. They're a nation of loose sand, he called it. In other words, totally nothing that would cohere, nothing that would bring them together, just loose sand. Every Chinese thinks he's as good as any other Chinese and thinks that he can do anything he likes. And he was complaining. As a nationalist leader, he was getting nowhere because the Chinese people were so impossible to convince of the importance of being a nation state. And that was less than 100 years ago, about 100 years ago. That was his major complaint. And, but since then, of course, after his death, the Sino-Japanese War of the 1930s did change a lot. It really brought Japanese nationalism and the nationalism of that particular kind, very vicious kind, down to the ordinary man, because they faced the Japanese throughout the country. And the hatred of the Japanese was turned into a propaganda thing by the nationalists in the war against Japan, and it really sank through. And amongst them are people who have grown up with a sense of nation. That China as a nation was nearly destroyed by the Japanese and should never be allowed to happen ever again. And that is what is at the heart of the Chinese nationalism today. But for most Chinese, I think they still are not very nationalistic. In fact, if you look at the Chinese history, the Chinese were not nationalistic against Britain or France or United States or even the Russians particularly. It's only against the Japanese that this nationalism emerged. So it's a very particularistic kind of nationalism. Whether this will spread and become really the poison that would infect the whole country or not, I hope not. And I feel that most Chinese will reject that in the end. The Chinese leaders, I believe, are wise enough not to do it. They've spent a tremendous amount of ink and paper trying to separate the idea of patriotism from nationalism. And in English, I don't know how different it means to other people, but the Chinese have made a tremendous effort to say, 爱国主义, patriotism, is not the same as 民族主义, which is nationalism. And the literature is vast into trying to differentiate the two. And the fact that they are trying to do that is because they are afraid of it, they don't want it, they think it could be harmful to China if the nationalism was allowed to spread, but they nevertheless want to keep up the idea of being patriotic, to care for the country, whether a nation or not, whether a nation state or not, the country. How to differentiate that and how to make the people aware that this difference is important is a task that they still have to face.
He wants one more.
One more. Anyone? Okay, please. You want to say something?
Thanks. Thank you very much for fascinating picture of all Chinese history. I was going to ask about relations between Confucius ethics and norms and how it's embedded in practices and socialism. You mentioned that in 1912 Confucianism was rejected by the society, but you can't reject it from your behavior, from your patterns, how you relate to your communities and to a ruler as well. And what do you think? What the connections are? I mean, in a level of practices and behavior.
Yes, in my talk, I failed to get to this point, which I wanted to make. You're quite right to bring me back to it. The key to what Xi Jinping has said, and Deng Xiaoping said it before him, and others have even earlier, that they have accepted socialism. You're quite right. But they always added socialism with Chinese characteristics, and most people laugh. What do you mean by Chinese characteristics? But I think they're very serious about that. But why do they want socialism? Because I think of all the Western ideas that, where I said what they want to master and what they've separated, socialism is on the 80% side. It's not been rejected. They rejected the liberalism, the individualism, all the other freedoms and so on, which they feel are not good for China. They've accepted socialism because it fits in very well with the idea of a caring state, a caring ruling elite that actually cares for equality or relative social equality, cares about better distribution of wealth, cares about everybody's welfare. That idea is not contrary to the Confucian thing. They've accepted that. But why put it in socialist terms rather than Confucian terms? Because one of the ideas that the Chinese did accept, among the ideas they didn't accept, one of them they didn't accept is the idea of progress. Among all the Western ideas, well, liberté, égalité, fraternité, I think they can understand fraternity up to a point, but égalité, they have never rejected that as an idea. I mean, reality is quite a different thing. Liberté is the one that they have really left out. Égalité, and égalité underlying it is this, some of the socialist ideals have the same idea there. And I would say that progress, as they understand it, is something they did accept from the historical thinking of the West, whether it comes from Hegel or Marx or whatever, that human progress, or Kantian for that matter, the progress is something that is, in fact, the idea of progress itself is also like the nation, is very new, 18th century idea of progress. Surprisingly, Chinese took to that almost immediately. When the word progress was introduced to China, they never hesitated about it. That's what they want. They want progress. Because in a way, they are materialistic in their whole foundations of their thinking. Material progress is something they had no difficulty understanding. In fact, they link science and technology exactly with that. That is, scientific progress is progress. So progress is acceptable. Therefore, to keep the word socialism is their most significant way of identifying with progress. Confucianism is not progress. Confucianism is looking to the past. The future can only be described as towards a socialist future in which the world will be fairer, think people will be more equal. I mean, I'm talking about ideals and rhetoric, I'm not talking about reality, but that it should be an ideal set out there to be aspired to, that signifies progress. And they don't want to reject that. So to keep socialism there is essential. The only thing they want to say is to reserve that 10 or 20% that is Chinese and identifiably Chinese, and will not lose their continuity and reconnect them with their whole glorious past. That they don't want to lose. So Chinese characteristics, socialism.
Thank you.